That is, by trying to see how the concept of freedom has developed in our culture, but also how rival understandings have emerged and done battle over time. So that will, I hope, enable us to reflect on where we stand in relation to them and to arrive at something like a judgment. Well, this is obviously a vast undertaking, so I need to do something to bring my materials under some kind of control. What I've decided to do is to concentrate largely on how this concept of freedom has been discussed in Anglophone philosophy. Now, I'm not saying the Anglophone tradition is the most interesting one, but it is the one that I know most about. However, in case that sounds too parochial, I should add that the Anglophone tradition has, in this case, as it happens, proved highly influential in our modern world, as we shall see. Within the Anglophone tradition, the earliest treatise in which the concepts of civil and political liberty are systematically analysed is also, as it happens, perhaps the most important work of Anglophone political philosophy, namely Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651. Chapter 21 of Leviathan is entitled Of the Liberty of Subjects, and that really inaugurated the modern debate. Moreover, Hobbes's understanding of liberty turned out to be extremely influential, so that his analysis is also a familiar one, as we shall see with the first slide. As you see, I've labeled this the liberal concept, and it's very straightforward. If, Hobbes argues, you have the power and the will to do something, then you're free to do it if there is no interference with the exercise of your power by any external agency. But obviously what you're looking at doesn't get us very far, for if freedom means no interference, it turns out that what you have to understand is, well, what counts as interference? Well, of course, Hobbes has thought of that, and here is his answer. External agents interfere when they act on the body of an individual in such a way that an action within the power of the individual is either prevented or compelled due to the application of physical force by the external agent in such a way as to render alternatives impossible. So what liberty means, as Hobbes summarizes, is absence of external impediments to motion. Notice it's only bodily interference that's said to take away freedom of action. One implication, which of course Hobbes really intends, is that if it's only your will that has been coerced, so for example, if you only obey the law for fear of the consequences of disobedience, you nevertheless act freely. That's very important to Hobbes. And as he summarizes, fear and liberty are consistent. Now, this way of thinking about freedom remains widely endorsed in Anglophone philosophy to this day. So this genealogical line, there'll be several, runs right down into our own time. However, the immediate reaction to Hobbes's analysis was to say that there's something obviously wrong with it. And I now want to turn to this critique, especially as it appears in the most celebrated work of political philosophy in the Anglophone tradition of the next generation. That is John Locke's Two Treatises of Government, first published in 1689. So what I want now to do is to sweep the board clean and start again with John Locke. When Locke turns in his second treatise of government to the question of freedom of action, he agrees that, of course, you're unfree to act if you're bodily prevented from exercising a power. But he insists that you are also rendered unfree if your will is coerced. I quote the second treatise. Should a robber break into my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, would that give him title? The question is purely rhetorical, for what Locke wants you to see is that in such a predicament, what we say is you really have no choice. Such coercion may not render any particular action impossible to perform, but it can make actions, as you might say, so unappealing that you never freely perform them. Later, this view was the one also taken up and much more elaborately by Jeremy Bentham, the founder of Anglophone utilitarianism. And from there, this account that I'm giving passed into the mainstream of Anglophone political thought. So with the addition of this argument, the picture of liberal freedom looks like this. We now have Hobbes's analysis right over on the left wing, not where he wants to be, incidentally, but we also have Locke's, and even more clearly, we have Bentham's over on the right wing. And the rival claim is that you are unfree whenever there is either bodily interference or else coercive interference by others that has the effect, and this is Locke's own phrase, of bending your will to their designs. Bending the will. Well, on this account, if you want a clear analysis of liberty, it turns out that what you need to understand is the concept of coercion. So it's rather remarkable that Locke never offers an analysis of what he means by coercion. And indeed, as far as I can see, the earliest Anglophone philosopher to make this further move is Bentham. And what you're now looking at is his analysis of the concept of coercion, which he gives in his book on the limits of the penal branch of legislation, written in the 1780s. So the genealogy I'm exploring now moves from the end of the 17th to the end of the 18th century. Now, Bentham, in talking about ineligibility by threats, is distinguishing between two ways of bending the will by coercion. One is that you could promise to reward someone for compliance with your will, so that if they refuse, they're no worse off. But the other is to threaten them with penalties for non-compliance, so that if they refuse, they are worse off. And Bentham's thought, as you see here, is that you can properly speak of coercion and thus ineligibility if and only if there is a threat. And the threat itself, Bentham adds, has to have certain properties. The threat must be credible, it must be immediate, and it must be serious. And so that is what Bentham wants to add to, and it's a crucial extension, the whole Hobbesian analysis of freedom. Now, is this perhaps the analysis of freedom we want? Well, in Anglophone political thinking, it was widely agreed for some considerable time that the answer is yes. And many philosophers would still accept what you're now looking at as the right analysis we would want to give of the concept of individual liberty. For example, what you're looking at is the preferred analysis of the concept in the most influential of all recent Anglophone discussions of my theme, Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. So this genealogical line runs right down to our time. However, within the Anglophone tradition, there arose a further complicating moment only a generation after Bentham, when John Stuart Mill published his classic essay on liberty in 1859. One of the moves Mill makes is to point out that the liberal tradition so far, what you're looking at, endorses one principle he thinks questionable. And here it is at the top of the chart, that freedom consists of no interference by external agencies, meaning another person, another group, a natural force, anything that can threaten you or leave you powerless. But what Mill asks in chapter 3 of the essay is, well, is it true that freedom is necessarily interpersonal in this way? Or could the agent who takes away your freedom somehow be yourself? So here it is added, and the self could, on this account, prevent or compel action. So let me go into this. Now you have the whole early liberal tradition over on the left and coming down. There you find Hobbes, you find Locke, you find Bentham. But the addition now proposed is that agents can impede their own actions or compel them. At least, it's very deep philosophical waters here, but at least in these three ways that I have put up. First, due to passion, that's to say the impact of some overpowering emotion. Here the suggestion is that the will can ally itself either with the passions of the soul, as Descartes calls them, in which case the resulting action will be an expression not of liberty, but of license. Or else the will can ally itself with reason, in which case the resulting action will be genuinely free. So the claim here is only actions undertaken out of reason are held to be freely performed. I suppose this strong connection of freedom with reason is most often associated with Kantian philosophy, but also much Christian thinking has categorically distinguished liberty from license in just this way. However, Mill's concern was not with the limiting power of the emotions, but with the power of civil society to limit your freedom by demanding conformity with its conventions and norms in such a way as to produce inauthenticity. So Mill's central suggestion is that you can render yourself unfree by living inauthentically. I quote chapter 3 On Liberty. The people of England think themselves free, but they choose what is customary in preference to their inclinations, until it does not occur to them to have any inclinations, except for what is customary. Now, Mill also might be thought to glance towards the third possibility I have here, although it's only in Marx, of course, that this begins to be fully explored. But this thought that false consciousness of the self is a way of interfering with your own liberty became central to our culture later in the Marxist tradition, and especially in our time through the work of the so-called Frankfurt School. So this line of the genealogy likewise comes right down into our own time. Well, we now have an array of different conceptions of freedom, but notice that they all have one basic element in common, and there it is at the top of the chart. They all explicate freedom as no interference. But towards the end of the 19th century, a number of Anglophone philosophers began to argue that this analysis is radically incomplete, especially by those Anglophones who had become deeply influenced by Hegel, Green, Bradley, Bosanquet, and others. According to their Hegelian view of things, we want to be free not merely to act at will, but rather to act in such a way as to realize the essence of our nature. So here is the thought: self-realization, realization of the essence of your nature. Or as Green puts it, freedom is doing what you have it in yourself to become, being what you have it in yourself to become. But on this account, the question that arises, as you see, as I've said, is what sort of way of life will a truly free person live? And here, as I put it up here, you come upon a classical and at the same time a Christian answer to the question, as well as other possibilities. The classical view, A, is, as Aristotle puts it, that we are political animals, so that you will realize the essence of your nature most fully, and hence count most fully as a free person when you exercise your talents in the public sphere. But according to the Christian view that, of course, historically challenged that vision of human nature, we realize our essence most fully not in the service of the community, but in the service of God. In the biblical phrase, to serve God is perfect freedom, because our essence is not political, it is spiritual. Now, B is not obviously a political idea at all, but with A, we arrive at the heart of what Isaiah Berlin liked to call the positive understanding of civil and political liberty, that it is not no interference, it is self-realization. Now, that is the view that in our tradition and in our time, you find in philosophers like Hannah Arendt, or in the Anglophone tradition, in someone like Charles Taylor. So this strand of the genealogy has likewise run right down into the present. So I want to pause at this point because I think it would be quite generally agreed that we now have on our chart as full a genealogy as can coherently be given of the concept of individual liberty, except, of course, that I have to add C to A and B. But this is the orthodoxy I want to end by challenging, because it seems to me that something crucial is still missing from our chart. So let me sweep it clear again and start all over again. I can best introduce this final part of my talk by noting that when Hobbes insists that liberty is simply absence of interference, one of his aspirations was to discredit a completely different way of understanding liberty that before his time had been almost universally accepted. The contention that Hobbes is trying to discredit is the one we find most clearly articulated in what I think is probably the most important text for the analysis of freedom in the whole Western tradition, namely the Codex of Roman Law. The part of the Codex known as the Digest begins with the law of persons, and it there introduces a fundamental distinction between the figure of the free person, the liber homo, by contrast with the figure of the servus, the slave. Now, according to this view of freedom, anyone who lives in servitude is by definition unfree. But the question is, what makes a slave unfree? And the answer is not that those living in servitude will necessarily be impeded in the pursuit of their goals. Slaves who only ever do their masters' or their rulers' bidding may never suffer any such coercive interference. So why are they nonetheless unfree? The jurist's answer: it is the mere fact of living in dependence on the arbitrary will of somebody else that makes you unfree. So freedom consists not in no interference, but in no dependence. And here I've laid out the whole way that would now run. You will not be a liber homo, what the English common law used to call a freeman. You will be a slave if there could be interference in consequence of your living in dependence on the arbitrary will of others. All right, so the question then is, who live as slaves? And there's the final question that you're looking at. Now, I've given the answer, but before I go into it, I have to admit that there is a worry about asking this question. These writers are not talking about chattel slavery, so it might be objected, and it sometimes was objected by their enemies, that they are diluting the horror of slavery for polemical purposes. However, at the same time, they are asking a very important question. Are there people of whom it can be said that they are made to live like slaves? Okay, here are the answers that were given. Let me first note the answer given in direct response to Hobbes in the 17th century, for example, by the Republican writer James Harrington. All who live as subjects of monarchs live as slaves. All monarchs, Harrington points out, have prerogatives, and those are discretionary powers. But to the extent that you have discretionary powers, your subjects are dependent upon your arbitrary will. But to live in dependence upon someone's arbitrary will is what it means to live as a slave. The second point becomes crucial with the rise of the European empires in the same period. All who live in colonies live as slaves. This, for example, was the argument used against the British by their American colonists in 1776, which explains why the declaration made by the colonists in that year was called the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, from dependence, of course. What they declared to be the enslaving power of the British Parliament, which was taxing them without their being represented, and hence confronting them as a purely arbitrary will. Let me next go to the answer which came powerfully to fore very soon afterwards in the revolutionary decade of the 1790s, that on this analysis, all women who lack independent means live as slaves. As Mary Wollstonecraft was to stress in her pioneering work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, women have to know, because they are usually in this culture wholly economically dependent upon men, how to commend themselves to men. So they do not form their own characters. They are thereby rendered servile in their attitudes. they are, in short, forced to live like slaves. And as you see, nor do I want to deny, indeed, I want to insist that there are contemporary instances of people who live in complete dependence upon arbitrary power. Consider, for example, the arbitrary power of bosses, especially over non-unionized labor forces, or still worse, illegal immigrants. People in those workforces live in such dependence that the idea of protesting against working conditions becomes a virtual impossibility. Or consider the powers of surveillance that many states, and indeed now many social media companies, turn out to be practicing, assembling masses of data for their own and undisclosed purposes, and on this account, leaving not just your privacy, but your freedom infringed because of what could be done with all the information they are harvesting. And finally, note, I'm not denying that there might be other possibilities of what I'm really talking about here, which is silent power. Well, here I draw to a close. May I just conclude with two observations? One is that all the interpretations of the concept of liberty that I've illustrated, as far as I can see, are coherent on their own terms. But if you now look at our chart, you can see they cannot possibly be combined. You're going to have to make some choices. Now, what I rather boldly want to claim is that as far as I can see, the choice that has to be made, this is a large claim, I'm afraid, is somewhere on this chart. The understanding of how to think about liberty is somewhere on this chart. But where? Well, that brings me to my concluding and most important point, which is, well, that is for you to work out. Thank you very much.